WHGE 95.3 coming up, the open eye.
Those of us that indulge in or commit intellectual violence don't do so for the pleasure of mental masturbation or ego diddling. We do so because the chains of oppression around people's minds are deep and difficult to remove.
Good morning, my children of the sun. Welcome to the Open Eye on WHGE 95.3 FM. I'm your host, Third Eye Optometrist Patrice Gibbs, here to get that third eye open, yes indeed. And I'm going to tell you what, we don't play around here. Every generation has its purpose. Ours is to reveal the truth and reverse the brainwashing. All right. Let me get my disclaimer out the way. There it is, okay.
The views and opinions expressed on the Open Eye are those of the hosts, guests, and contributors, and do not reflect the policy or position of WHGE 95.3 FM, nor our sponsor, the Delaware Center for Homeless Vets. Any content provided by Open Eye's hosts, guests, or contributors are theirs and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, company, or individual.
WHGE 95.3 FM. This is the Open Eye. All right. Start off with a public service announcement. Coming up, the Youth Summit 2026. That will be Wednesday, May 13th from 5:30 to 8:30 p.m. Route 9 Library, 3022 Newcastle Avenue in Newcastle, Delaware. Here's what's happening. Group discussion of quotes, toasts, and sayings, spoken word, rap, and poetry, storytelling, skit presentation, musical performances, light refreshments, Light refreshments will be provided. That's Wednesday, May 13th from 5:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. The Youth Summit 2026. Okay, and youth ages 6 to 16. All right. Hey, Sister Sherry, I see you there. Let's get them started here. All right. Today on the Open Eye, we are not dealing with myths. We're dealing with memory. Okay? And memory, when it's honest, is dangerous. Because memory reminds us that freedom in this country has never been given, it's always been taken. Let's start with Harriet Tubman, not the watered down version they handed school children. And not the postage stamp, not the safe smiling legend. I'm talking about the real Harriet Tubman, the strategist, the freedom fighter, the woman who understood something this country still struggles to admit. Liberation is not a suggestion, it's a decision. And once you make that decision, there's no turning back. Tubman didn't just escape slavery, she declared war on it. She went back again and again and again. She moved through hostile territory with discipline, intelligence, and an unshakable code. Forward, always forward, no retreats, no negotiations with bondage. Now fast forward to a place most Americans have never been taught to respect. Mound by you, but by formerly enslaved people, owned, governed, and sustained by black hands. Banks, schools, businesses, land, real power, not symbolic, not temporary, real. Understand what that means. It means that when left alone without sabotage, without extraction, without interference, black people didn't just survive, they built, they governed, they prospered. And that right there is part of the story that always gets buried. Because if people knew how black excellence has been built from nothing only to be undermined, redlined, legislated, or outright destroyed, it would force a different conversation about what's really been happening in this country. And that brings us to voting rights, the ballot, the battlefield that never closed. From Reconstruction to Jim Crow, from poll taxes to modern day voter suppression tactics. From the promise of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to its steady erosion. What you are witnessing is not a glitch in democracy, it is a design. Because power concedes nothing, not land, not labor, not voice, without resistance. So today we connect the dots. Harriet Tubman's forward only mission. Mound Bayou's proof of possibility. And the ongoing fight over who gets to decide the future in this country. This is not history as nostalgia. This is history as instruction. And if you're paying attention, it's also a warning. This is the open eye. WHGE 95.3 FM. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery and then went back to get others. I know you know who Harriet Tubman is and that she did that. But I just want you to take that in for a second. Harriet Tubman was held captive and bound to unpaid, back-breaking labor since birth under penalty of torture or death. She managed to escape that life. And she turned her F around and went back to get everyone else who was still trapped in it. And then she did it again, 18 more times. When Abraham Lincoln was unsure whether or not he was prepared to make a stand against slavery, Harriet Tubman basically said he should stop being such a diaper baby and that guys who are too scared to end slavery don't deserve to win wars. Yeah. Not only did she secret over 300 slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad, but she acted as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War. And became the first woman to lead an armed assault in the Civil War. All right? Let me keep that energy going because it's justified. Harriet Tubman isn't just a historical figure. She's a tactical genius, a guerrilla warrior, and arguably one of the most courageous humans that ever breathed. All right? And stew on that even further. When people talk about her bravery, they often forget she did all of this while suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy. Orange's actually got a bone spur. As a teenager, as an overseer, threw a 2-pound metal weight at another enslaved person. It hit Harriet instead, crushing her skull. For the rest of her life, she experienced sudden seizures and sleeping spells, narcolepsy. Let me tell you about the badass factor. She is leading groups of fugitives through freezing woods, hunted by manhunters with dogs, while knowing she could spontaneously fall unconscious at any moment. She didn't let a dramatic brain injury stop her. All right. I mentioned she went back 19 times. Let's look at the math for that risk. The bounty. By the 1850s, the combined rewards for her capture reached roughly $40,000, which is well over $1 million in today's currency. She didn't just wander south. She used disguises, dressing as an elderly woman or man. She mastered herbology to keep babies quiet, using paregoric to ensure they didn't cry and give away their position. And she used the stars for navigation. And here was the rule. She famously carried a revolver. It wasn't just for protection against slave catchers. It was to ensure no one in her party turned back. If you panicked and tried to return, you became a liability to the entire network. Her motto, you go on or die. Tell you about the Combahee River raid. All right. She freed 700 people in one go. One go. This wasn't a stealthy nighttime escape. It was a full-scale military operation. She was the mastermind. She had spent months scouting the river, identifying where the Confederate torpedoes or the mines were hidden. On June 2nd, 1863, she guided 3 Union steamships up the river. As the ships blew their whistles, enslaved people realized this was the Freedom Boat and rushed the shores. The result? It remains one of the most successful slave rescues in history. And she was the first woman to lead such a mission in U.S. history. Even after the war ended and slavery was abolished, she didn't go sit on the porch. Despite being desperately poor for much of her later life, the government was notoriously slow to pay her veterans' pension. She established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged on her own property. When she underwent brain surgery in the late 1890s to alleviate the pain from her childhood injury, she refused anesthesia. She refused it. Instead, she bit down on a bullet, just like the soldiers she had seen during the Civil War. To put her in modern terms, imagine a political prisoner escaping a high security black site, then choosing to break back into that same black site 19 times and pull others out, all while having $1 million bounty on her head and a chronic neurological condition. Badass is an understatement. This is the Open Eye. Hey, Cousin Mike, I see you there. All right. WHGE 95.3 FM. This is the Open Eye. Get with memory here. All right. Tell you about the beacon of the Delta, the rise of Mound Bayou. Mound Bayou, Mississippi stands as a monumental testament to African American agency, economic grit, and the pursuit of true autonomy following the Civil War. Founded in 1887, it wasn't just a town, it was a radical experiment in self-governance during the height of the Jim Crow era. The town was founded by Isaiah Montgomery and his cousin Benjamin T. Green, both formerly enslaved people from the Joseph Davis, brother Jefferson Davis plantation. They purchased 840 acres of swampy, uncleared land in the Mississippi Delta from the Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas Railroad. Through sheer manual labor, the settlers cleared the thick brakes of cane and timber. By the turn of the century, their promised land had become a thriving agricultural hub. By the early 20th century, Mound Bayou had transformed into a bustling municipality that rivaled white-dominated towns in infrastructure and sophistication. I'll tell you about key infrastructure and assets. 1, land ownership. The community collectively owned 30,000 acres of fertile Delta soil. At its peak, the town and surrounding area supported roughly 4,000 residents. The economy was anchored by 3 cotton gins, a sawmill, and a cottonseed oil mill. Modern amenities. In that era, where many rural towns remained in the dark, Mound Bayou boasted lighted streets, a telephone exchange, and its own train station depot. The town was home to 6 churches, a library, a town hall, and high-performance schools, ensuring that the next generation was educated as well as independent. The success of Mound Bayou provides a profound look into the strategies of Black survival and excellence in the post-Reconstruction South. Isaiah Montgomery practiced a complex form of accommodationist politics by maintaining cordial relations with white business leaders and politicians. He shielded Mound Bayou from the racial violence that decimated other successful Black enclaves like Tulsa. However, this required a painful trade-off. Montgomery was famously the only Black delegate at the 1890 Mississippi Constitutional Convention, where he voted for a franchise amendment that effectively disenfranchised most Black voters in the state, believing it was the only way to preserve his town's peace. Damn. Mound Bayou was a psychological fortress. For a Black person in the early 1900s, it was a rare place where they could walk the streets with dignity, see a Black sheriff deposit money in a Black-owned bank, the Bank of Mound Bayou, and receive a trial before a Black judge. This created a unique environment for entrepreneurship to flourish without the immediate threat of whitecapping or business sabotage. The town's 40 businesses and 30,000 acres created a closed-loop economy, because the community owned the means of production, the gins and the land. The wealth stayed within the town. This self-sufficiency proved that the Black codes and sharecropping systems were not a result of lack of skill, but a result of systemic resource theft. While the Great Depression and the decline of the cotton market eventually pressured the town's economy, Mound Bayou survived. It later became a crucial headquarters for the Regional Council of Negro Leadership in the 1950s, serving as a base for civil rights icons like Medgar Evers. Today, it remains a hallowed site of American history, a reminder that even in the most oppressive environments, the drive for self-determination can build a city out of a swamp. Mound Bayou, and it's still there. WHGE 95.3 FM, the Open Eye. Hey, Steve. All right. I see you listening on the stream. That's cool. All right. WHGE 95.3 FM. I'm Patrice Gibbs, your third eye optometrist. This is the Open Eye. How come there weren't more Mound Bayou? How come there weren't more black communities? Yeah, we know about Tulsa and Rosewood, how they were burned down and what have you. But see, the thing is, they had to have a start. They had to start somewhere. And sometimes the startup is the most difficult things if you don't have a foundation to build from. All right. All right. This is from Ashley the Baroness, TikTok influencer, historian, what have you. All right. And check her out, Ashley the Baroness. She said, I was going through some post-World War II planning documents, old housing files, census reports, urban renewal notes, that sort of thing. And I found something that made me stop and go, wait, what? Because while this country was celebrating the post-war boom, the federal government was quietly tracking where black families build wealth. Not to support it, not to expand it, of course not, just to keep an eye on it. And I realized nobody tells us this part. So let me explain what was actually happening. Right after World War II, several federal agencies started making maps and reports from where black middle-class neighborhoods were forming. Not poor neighborhoods, middle class. This included the FHA, the old HOLC system, which, by the way, their redlining maps were still influencing decisions being made, the Census Bureau, the Department of Commerce, and city planning boards. And what were they tracking? Well, they wanted to know where black families were buying homes, where black families owned businesses were growing, where black income was rising, where black professionals were moving. So basically, they were mapping black prosperity. And the language in these reports, it wasn't positive. You see phrases like Negro income concentration areas, areas of rising Negro prosperity, shifts in racial stability. And once those neighborhoods were identified, the pattern becomes obvious. In cities across the country, Detroit, Chicago, DC, Atlanta, St. Louis, and plenty more, black middle-class neighborhoods were flagged as risk to the existing racial balance. And after those neighborhoods were flagged, here's what tended to follow. Highways cut straight through them. Zoning laws changed to block business growth. Mortgage access tightened. Schools were gerrymandered. Urban renewal targeted those areas. These weren't random decisions. They showed up right after the mapping. What the planners were worried about wasn't poverty. It was black stability. Black families using the GI Bill. Black home ownership going up. Black business districts getting strong. Black upward mobility. Because to them, that meant political power, voting power, economic influence. And the planning documents read like they were trying to keep that from growing too fast. So here's the part that made it click for me. By the 1950s, these maps were being used to justify decisions designed to break apart black neighborhoods, thriving black neighborhoods. Highway reconstruction, redevelopment, denial of loans, neighborhood clearance, school lines drawn to keep districts unequal. Not because the neighborhoods were failing, but because they were succeeding. Planning boards literally described black middle-class areas as something that needed to be managed before they influenced nearby white suburbia. So the government wasn't tracking crisis. They were tracking progress and stepping in. So here's the real takeaway. Black prosperity after World War II wasn't something the government just noticed. It was something they monitored. And the resistance to it wasn't random. It was baked into housing policy, zoning policy, highway planning, redevelopment strategy. Different decade, different wording, same pattern. Track it, limit it, redirect it, contain it. And once you understand that pattern, a lot of what we see in modern housing just starts to make a whole lot more sense. WHGE 95.3 FM. Be right back. This is The Open Eye. Yeah, that was from Ashley Barron's. Let's be clear about what she laid out. Because this isn't some accidental footnote in history. This is surveillance of success. While America was running victory laps after World War II, talking about freedom, prosperity, the American dream, behind the scenes, the federal government was doing something very different. They were asking, where are black people winning, and how do we slow that down? That's the part they don't teach. Because we've been sold a lie that the problem was always black poverty. No. The documents show the problem was black progress. Not struggle, stability. Not failure, formation of power. Because once black families started buying homes, building businesses, stacking income, and clustering into functional, self-sustaining communities, that's when the alarm bells went off. And what did the system do? It didn't invest, it didn't protect, it didn't partner, it intervened. Highways didn't just happen to cut through those neighborhoods. Zoning laws didn't just evolve. Loans didn't just tighten by coincidence. That was policy reacting to the data. They mapped black success the same way you map a storm system. Not to admire it, but to control its impact. And let's talk about that language. Racial stability. That's not neutral. That's cold. That means too many black people doing too well in one place makes white systems uncomfortable. So what do? You disrupt it, you fragment it, you disperse it. That's what urban renewal really meant in practice. Remove the concentration of black power before it consolidates. And here's the cold truth. When you hear people today say, why don't black communities just rebuild? Or why don't they just invest and grow? You're looking at the aftermath of a system that historically said, whenever they build, we break it. That wasn't neglect. Neglect is passive. This was active containment strategy. And once you understand that, once you see that black prosperity was treated as a variable to be managed, not encouraged, then modern disparities stop looking mysterious. They start looking engineered. Because the blueprint didn't disappear, it evolved. Different language, different policies, same logic. Identify growth, apply pressure, prevent consolidation of power. So the question isn't why do these patterns keep happening? The real question is, why are we still pretending they're accidents? This is The Open Eye. And Patrice Gibbs. WHGE 95.3 FM. The Open Eye. The psychopower and the cost of amnesia. Never forget this. Under Ronald Reagan, may roast in hell, may the devil sodomize him with a pitchfork. The national debt didn't just grow, it tripled. From $738 billion to $2.1 trillion. The top tax rate for the wealthiest Americans didn't just drop, it collapsed. From 70% to 28%. His administration secretly sold missiles to Iran in what became the Iran-Contra scandal. And while a deadly epidemic spread, tens of thousands of Americans died during the early years of AIDS with a federal response that history still questions. At the same time, the dismantling of mental health infrastructure without a real replacement pushed vulnerable people out into the streets, laying the groundwork for the modern homelessness crisis we're still dealing with today. Now fast forward. Bill Clinton leaves office with a booming economy, GDP growth strong, over 22 million jobs created, unemployment at a 33-year low. The country says, we got it from here, and hands the keys to George W. Bush. What follows? Recession. Then Barack Obama walks into an economy hemorrhaging, losing jobs, 700,000 a month. Over time, that administration stabilizes it as roughly 16 million jobs and cuts unemployment nearly in half. Again, your country says, thanks, we got it from here, and passes the baton to Donald Poopy Drawers Trump, inheriting one of the longest economic expansions in American history. 128 consecutive months of growth. What happened? Recession. Step back. Take a look at the pattern. 10 out of the last 11 recessions have occurred under Republican presidents. Now zoom out even further, beyond just economic cycles. Major pillars of American life didn't appear out of thin air. Policies tied to Democratic leadership have established Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the 40-hour work week, minimum wage protections, veterans benefits, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, public health measures like restricting indoor smoking face instant resistance before becoming standard. So the real question isn't just about left versus right, it's about memory. How many times does a system get repaired only to be handed back to the same patterns that broke it in the first goddamn place? How long does a country keep expecting to be rescued from consequences it keeps recreating? Because at some point, this isn't about politics. It's about whether a nation learns or keeps repeating the same pattern and calling it something new. Yeah. According to The Atlantic and insiders within the White House staff, Donald Trump is continuously referring to himself as the most powerful person on the planet or the most powerful person who ever lived. And that he actually doesn't care whether or not the Democrats win the midterms. And they take both the House and the Senate. He only cares about consolidating power amongst himself. And even within the White House staff, there are now people who are leaking out this information because they are actually afraid that this fool has lost his mind. That he can now get away with absolutely anything. And that could spell an absolute disaster for the country and the democracy. This cannot be allowed to continue unabated. Congress, the Supreme Court, and people all need to come together and make sure that we do not lose our freedom. That ain't gonna happen. You're at home somebody who thinks he is above the law. Representative Melanie Stansbury. She said, imagine getting in a time machine and going back to 1776 and telling the founding fathers that the king would one day be reminding America about the importance of democracy and America's checks and balances. That's the timeline we're living in. Remember, King Charles got up and said that. He's a king. And he's reminding a so-called democracy, so-called beacon of freedom, about the importance of democracy and the checks and balances in the Constitution. Let's cut through the noise and get to the spine of what's being said here. Because this isn't about personality, it's about power. When reports, whether from the Atlantic or unnamed insiders, start describing a sitting president like Donald the Orange Disaster Trump as someone openly fixated on being the most powerful person on the planet, that's not just ego talk. That's the language of consolidation. That's the language of a man who sees institutions not as guardrails, but as obstacles. And here's the real issue. Democracies don't collapse overnight. They erode quietly, gradually, piece by piece. First, the idea that elections don't matter as much as control. Then the normalization of being above the law. Then the quiet fear inside the very building that's supposed to run the goddamn country. Because when staffers, people inside the machine, start leaking out fear, that tells you something deeper than politics is happening. That tells you the internal checks are weakening. That tells you people who see the gears turning up close don't trust where it's headed. Now layer that against Representative Melanie Stansbury and what she said. Her points cut deeper than a tweet. It's historical irony wrapped in a warning. Imagine the architects of 1776, men obsessed with breaking away from monarchy, from unchecked authority, being told that centuries later, Americans would be debating whether their own leader sees himself as untouchable. That's not just irony, that's drift. Because the American system was designed on one core assumption. No one is above the law. Not the president, not Congress, not the courts. Nobody. So when rhetoric or behavior suggests otherwise, it forces a question that people don't like to ask out loud. Are the guardrails still holding? And here's where the conversation needs to stay grounded. Claims from media outlets and anonymous insiders should always be approached with scrutiny. But the pattern, the broader pattern of executive power pushing against limits, that's not speculation. That's been playing out in real time for years across administrations. This is bigger than one man, bigger than one party. It's about whether the system still has the strength to restrain power when power decides it doesn't want to be restrained. Because history is very clear on one thing. When leaders start believing they can get away with anything, the real test isn't what they do next. The real test is what everyone else does about it. This is the open eye. WHGE 95.3 FM. I'm Patrice Gibbs. You know what? Let's stop playing word games with history. The Civil War was not about states' rights. That's not an opinion, interpretation, or political spin. It's a documented confession. Read the Declarations of Succession. Mississippi didn't whisper. They declared slavery the position of the North versus the position of the South and called it the greatest material interest of the world. South Carolina didn't dance. They cited the failure of northern states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. These weren't coded messages. They were declarations of intent. When someone tells you the war was about states' rights, the only honest response is a state's right to do what? The Confederacy answered that in plain English: the right to own, sell, and profit from human beings' bondage. The states' rights narrative was a post-war manufacture. It was a massive project, a historical laundering by the United Daughters of the Confederacy to rebrand a white supremacist rebellion into a romanticized lost cause. That ain't history. That's propaganda. History doesn't just repeat, it rhymes with a vengeance. When the first Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877 and the withdrawal of federal troops, the backlash wasn't gradual, it was an avalanche. Southern Redeemer legislatures moved with surgical precision to dismantle the black vote. They didn't just suggest restrictions, they codified them. The Mississippi Plan in 1890 set the standard for constitutional disenfranchisement through poll taxes and literacy tests. The results? In Louisiana, there were 130,000 registered black voters in 1896. By 1904, after the new state constitution took effect, that number was slashed to just 1,342 from 130,000. That's a 99% collapse in political representation. Grandfather clauses, designed to ensure illiterate whites could vote while black citizens whose grandfathers had been enslaved and thus couldn't vote were barred. That wasn't tradition. It was a coup against democracy. Let's talk about the second Reconstruction, because it's under the knife. We are watching the same movie today. The second Reconstruction began on August 6, 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. For decades, it was the teeth of the 15th Amendment. But look at the numbers. Since the Supreme Court began gutting the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, the floodgates opened. Tell you about the Shelby effect. Within 24 hours of the Shelby decision, Texas announced it would implement a strict voter ID law that had previously been blocked. Between 2012 and 2018, nearly 1,700 polling places were closed across the South, primarily in black and Latino neighborhoods. Modern gerrymandering. In states like Alabama and Louisiana, legislatures have fought tooth and nail to maintain maps that pack black voters into single districts, effectively neutralizing their power in the other 5 or 6 congressional seats. It's the pattern of the rollback. When the Supreme Court weakens voting protections today, they aren't stumbling into these outcomes. They are making calculated choices that echo the Taney Court's Dred Scott decision. They are signal boosting a long American tradition, restricting the political power of black citizens while maintaining the language and neutrality. The first Reconstruction ended because the federal government lost its will to protect its citizens. Excuse me. The second Reconstruction is ending because the legal framework for that protection is being systematically dismantled. 1877, the withdrawal of the military. 2026, the withdrawal of the law. The result is the same, a retreat into a new Jim Crow where the tactics are cleaner: judicial restraint, race neutrality, election integrity. But the income is just as effing dirty. Don't get distracted by the respectable language of the courtroom. Listen to the outcome. Just as the Confederates told you exactly what they were fighting for in 1861, the legislative and judicial rollbacks of the day are telling you exactly what they are protecting. If you're paying attention, you know it isn't the sanctity of the ballot. It's the preservation, a hierarchy that was supposed to have died in 1865. Let's stop pretending this is neutral law. It's not. It's power dressed up in robes. What you're looking at from the Supreme Court of the United States is not inconsistency. It's not confusion. It's not some accidental contradiction, constitutional interpretation. It's a pattern. And patterns tell the truth that opinions try to hide. Because when this court strikes down race conscious policies meant to repair the damage of centuries, whether in education, voting rights, or representation, they suddenly become strict constructionists. Suddenly the Constitution is colorblind. Suddenly history doesn't matter. But when race is used to police, to exclude, to target, to ban, now the court finds flexibility. Now it finds deference. Now it finds justification. That's not law, that's ideology. And the comparison people are whispering but need to say out loud is this. The shadow of Dred Scott versus Stanford and the Taney Court isn't about identical rulings. It's about identical logic. Back then, the court said black people had no rights that white people were bound to respect. Today, the court doesn't say it that plainly. It doesn't need to. It just builds a framework where any attempt to correct racial injustice is unconstitutional. But systems that produce racial injustice remain untouched, unchallenged, and in many cases protected. That's the game. Now, let's break this down. All right? If race is used to expand opportunity for historically excluded people, unconstitutional. If race is used to restrict, surveil, or exclude those same people, permissible, or at least tolerated. That's not color blindness. That's selective blindness. And when you line these rulings up side by side, the message becomes unmistakable. The Constitution, as interpreted by this court, is not neutral ground. It is a gatekeeping tool. And the gate swings open or closed depending on who benefits. Because the real doctrine here isn't equal protection. It's protection of a status quo. One where any policy that disrupts racial hierarchy is treated as suspect, while policies that reinforce it are treated as routine. That's why people are calling this reckless. That's why people are calling it racist, because the outcomes aren't theoretical. They shape who gets access, who gets excluded, and who gets targeted. And history has always shown us what happens when the highest court in the land aligns itself not with justice, but with power and white supremacy. It doesn't interpret the law. It defines the limits of freedom. This is The Open Eye. I'm Patrice Gibbs. WHGE 95.3 FM. Harriet Tubman carried a pistol on her slaving missions, not for security against slave hunters, but for any escapee that wanted to go back. Keep going or die was her mantra. This wasn't mythology. This wasn't symbolism. This was discipline under life and death conditions. Tubman didn't carry that pistol for drama. She carried it because the Underground Railroad wasn't a metaphor. It was a war corridor. Every step forward was stolen from a system that was designed to drag you back in chains. And her message, keep going or die, wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. Because one person turning back didn't just risk their own life. It risked everybody. Exposure meant capture. Capture meant torture. Torture meant information. Information meant the entire operation collapses. So when I invoke Tubman, I'm invoking a standard. Once you know the path to freedom, retreat becomes betrayal, not just of yourself, but of the collective. Now place that standard next to Clarence Thomas. And that's where the tension explodes. This is a man who rose through doors that were pried open by collective struggle, legal strategy, protest, policy, and blood. Organizations like the NAACP didn't just appear out of thin air. They fought case by case, law by law, to dismantle structures that would have otherwise kept people like Thomas locked out entirely. Yet, once inside, Thomas didn't just distance himself, he spent decades discrediting the very mechanisms that made his rise possible. Under Ronald Reagan, may he roast in hell and may the devil sodomize him with a pitchfork, Thomas gains power at the EEOC and uses that platform not to reinforce civil rights protections, but to question the legitimacy of institutions fighting for them. Not to expand the latter, but to argue that the latter shouldn't exist. That's when the rhetoric, the welfare dependency framing, even when directed at his own family. That wasn't just personal commentary. That language plugged directly into a broader political narrative used to justify dismantling social safety nets and stigmatizing black poverty as moral failure instead of structural design. And then the policy record, affirmative action, something that undeniably intersected with Thomas's own educational trajectory. This reframed as unconstitutional discrimination. The Voting Rights Act, one of the crown jewels of the civil rights movement, gets weakened. Protections designed to measure and correct racial discrimination are recast as overreach. This isn't just ideological difference, it's a fundamental disagreement about how history works. One side says history creates inequalities that must be actively corrected. The other says law should act as if those equalities don't exist, as if those inequalities don't exist. And when the latter position prevails in a country with a documented history of exclusion, the effect is not neutrality, it's preservation of the status quo. Even the shadow of the Anita Hill hearings lingers in this story, not just as a moment of personal controversy, but as a cultural flashpoint about power, credibility, and whose voices are believed when systems are on trial. So when people say wrong side of history, that phrase can sound abstract, but in this context, it's more concrete than that. It's about alignment. Tubman's legacy is rooted in collective liberation, risking everything to move people forward, refusing to let fear or pressure send the mission backward. Thomas' legacy reflects something else, a legal philosophy that narrows the tools available to address inequality, even when those tools were forged in response to centuries of documented harm. That's the tension. Not just disagreement, but direction. Forward under pressure, or backward under principle. And history has a long memory when it comes to which is which. Harriet Tubman would have shot Clarence Thomas. This is the Open Eye. WHGE 95.3 FM. I hope you learned something, because I learned something before I got here. So what did we learn today? We learned that freedom has a pattern, and so does opposition to it. Harriet Tubman showed us that liberation requires courage and clarity. No confusion, no compromise with oppression. You either move forward or you get pulled backward. Mountain Bayou showed us that when people control their own institutions, their own land, their own economy, they don't just exist, they thrive. And that truth has always made power uncomfortable. And the fight over voting rights reminds us that control of the future is always the real prize. Because whoever controls the vote controls the policy, controls the resources, and controls the narrative. And if you look closely, none of these battles are over. They just change uniforms. The language gets softer, the tactics get more sophisticated, the headlines get shorter, but the objective remains the same. Limit power, redirect power, contain power. So the question becomes, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you treat history like a museum piece or something to look at, nod at, and walk past? Or do you treat it like a blueprint? Because Harriet Tubman didn't leave us stories just to admire. She left a method. Mountain Bayou didn't exist just to be remembered. It existed to prove what's possible. And voting rights were never meant to be symbolic. They were meant to be used, protected, and when necessary, fought for. This is the open eye, where we don't just look, we see. And once you see, you don't get the luxury of pretending you didn't. All right? And as we always tell you, destiny determines who enters your life, but you decide who stays. Therefore, value those who value you, and don't treat those as a priority, who treat you as an option. This is the Open Eye on WHGE 95.3 FM. Thanks for joining us. I'm Patrice Gibbs. Peace. All right. Off the air here. I always tell you, don't think I forgot. Keep your eye on it. Global African supremacy. The world was a much better place when the black man ruled. Peace and love. Come on, baby.